So today's session, Clarifying and Simplifying CED to Localize Prosperity, is brought to you by the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. We're a national network of several hundred community organizations and individuals working to create local economic opportunities that support an inclusive and sustainable economy. Here you can see some of our members' logos, and there you can see our new website member map. New, I guess it was launched last fall, so it's not as shiny as it was, but it's still a relatively recent addition to the networking tools on our website. You can find members close to you on the map located at the web address listed on the bottom of the screen. If you like the session today, consider joining us by becoming a member, signing up for our free e-newsletters, or following us on social media. CEDNet's done a number of webinars like this in recent years. Here you can see some of the topics that were covered. And all of these are on our website, free for members. So allow me to welcome you again. Here you can see a photo of me. Today's webinar is divided into two parts. To start, we'll have a presentation by Karen Leach that will last about 30 minutes. And then Karen's presentation will be followed by a short commentary and reflection by Stuart Perry, who will pick out some of the key components of Karen's presentation as they pertain to the history and trajectory of community economic development in North America. Then in the Q&A at the end for the last 20 or 25 minutes, I'll ask Karen the questions that you've posted in the chat box. And once again, go ahead and post those anytime. So just before we get into the presentation, let's do a little poll of participants. We wanted to see, first of all, if participants on the webinar are familiar with the Localise West Midlands resource, Localizing Prosperity. If you've seen that before, or it's new to you with this session. And the other poll, and you can check as many boxes as you want, and the second one is, in what capacity are you trying to apply CED in theory or in practice? Select all that apply. So while people are answering the poll, let me just give a quick introduction to the session. I have to say, when I first saw the Localise West Midlands resource for mainstreaming CED a couple of years ago, I wrote to Karen right away. It was a very exciting publication. I wrote to Stuart as well, and it was, I think, a very valuable and groundbreaking synthesis, collection of a lot of the literature and analysis of the contribution CED can make in local revitalization. So although their study and the application is primarily focused on West Midlands in the UK and the way they're putting it into practice, I think the work does seek to catalyze ideas across the UK and make links with other organizations like CEDNet, so we're very happy that Karen's agreed to come and present it today. In recent years, they've done a very thorough analysis of the evidence base for economic localization and CED, and with Localizing Prosperity, the newer resource, they try to tackle the challenge of simplifying and outlining a CED approach, what the sources of inspiration are, guidance for implementation for diverse audiences, whether that's public institutions, communities, businesses, or anyone interested in making places better and sharing prosperity. So we're very happy to have Karen here to present what they've learned and the process they've been through and where they're at, and hear Stuart's reactions. But before I turn things over to Karen, let's just check in on the poll results. And there's a good chunk of people that hadn't heard of the resource until now, so that's good. Karen will be introducing it to some new audiences and a couple of people that have seen it a bit. So this is a valuable introduction. And in the other poll, it looks like the plurality, a good chunk of folks are involved in CED through a nonprofit, at least one community member, a few research folks, and a couple of consultants. So that's terrific. Very good. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Karen Leach. She's been coordinator of Localise West Midlands since it was created in 2002, and she's responsible for the organization's strategy and delivery in conjunction with its board. Her professional interests are in economic efficiency in terms of sustainability outcomes and in economic awareness and empowerment amongst the general public. She's also on the management committee of Birmingham Friends of the Earth, which runs an environmental community center called The Warehouse, and was formerly campaign support officer at Birmingham Friends of the Earth. Localise West Midlands is a small nonprofit think tank, campaign group, and consultancy involving around 15 people as members and associates. It's located in Digbeth, and I think we'll see a map of roughly where that is later on. And its aim is to promote a more localized approach to supply chains, money flow, and decision-making in order to form a more just and sustainable economy. Thanks for joining us, Karen.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have been invited. Shall I make a start?
Yes, why don't you jump into it there.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, as perhaps my little biog there suggested, I've got no formal experience of economic development, no formal training. I got involved in the agenda through Birmingham Friends of the Earth local group, which is again, a very small organisation, which obviously does environmental campaigning work. And they gave me at one stage, as a very inexperienced volunteer, they gave me a local transport plan to look at. And I was really quite fascinated. I don't know how many people can say that, but fascinated by how we can set rules for spend and land use and things that create good places, or rules that destroy them. And that's what got me into thinking about the economy and how important that was to influence if you want to make a difference to human beings. Localize was established in 2002. I was really keen to get involved. So I'm just going to trot through the research that we've done and some of the sort of thinking behind it and some of our guidance and good practice, and then go on to what we're thinking of doing next. I think somebody just advanced my slide. I didn't advance it myself.
Sorry about that.
That's fine, no. I was wondering if it had a mind of its own for a moment. Mike just described the organisation to you, so you know roughly what it is that we do. We've done work for local authorities around public procurement. We do a little bit of work with communities, sometimes on things like planning issues, community energy schemes. We've done some more sort of research-based work on measuring prosperity, and some work on promoting small business and independent retail. But the work that I'm about to describe to you is really sort of something quite groundbreaking for us, that's very much the mainstream of our agenda, as well as being about mainstreaming these sorts of issues. You can tell how small we are from the fact that there's only about 15 of us involved, and actually only one employee, and that's me. So bear with us if anything seems a little bit flaky. We're doing our best with very limited resources. Okay, so let me just click there. Hang on. The area that we cover, Digbeth is actually a tiny little suburb on the edge of Birmingham, which is in the middle of this red dot that you see on the map. It's a very small area in the middle of the UK. Small but very densely populated, with a population of just under 2.5 million. It covers the big cities of Birmingham, which is the UK's second city, and Wolverhampton, and an area known as the Black Country. Nobody's quite sure why, which is a collection of small old industrial towns. So small, densely populated, and Birmingham is a major international commercial centre. And as far as I'm concerned, that might be why it and its surroundings have such high levels of deprivation. Income inequality within Birmingham is greater than any other English city. We've got 14% unemployment, which is amongst the highest in the country. We're very ethnically diverse. And in terms of our governance culture, I'd say we're a little bit obsessed with our second city status and hanging on to that in the threat of Manchester, which is always threatening to take over. And we're obsessed with being global, and our global connections and our trading with China and our inward investment and so on. And we find that the Black Country, as a local authority area, is much more open to ideas. So in terms of the UK context, I think nationally we have a media and politics dominated by neoliberal perceptions of the paramountcy of growth, and not of who benefits from that growth. And that's both left and right parties, local and national government. And there's a sort of a blind faith that trickle down will work, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, I'd say. We don't have very well developed ideas of community economic development at all. It's really not been a term that's been mentioned for a good few decades, really, and we certainly have nothing like the network that you have. CEDNet, I think you call it for short. We do, however, have transition towns and things like this, which we were the birthplace of transition. It's a brilliant initiative, grassroots initiative, but it's not perhaps all that inclusive or business friendly, and it's seen as very much alternative. That's not a criticism of it, just the culture in which it's trying to make a difference. We have a traditional left-wing party set of parties that distrust sustainability in small business, I think, and perhaps that's reciprocated as well. Then we have organisations like the Centre for Local Economic Strategies and the New Economics Foundation, who are well worth looking up if you don't know them, who've long made the case for approaches about building economic development from within a place and not relying on inward investment. And they've had some successes, but they're not that, perhaps not that big a voice within policy making within the country. And then, of course, we have an austerity agenda because of government cuts in public spending. That is hitting local authorities in more deprived areas perhaps harder. And in the last few years, there's been more interest in our agenda, perhaps because of that. Because I think people realise that with very limited funds, we do have to maximise the local returns from those funds. Oh, and we have local enterprise partnerships, which were introduced by just the previous government after the recession. And they're very much dominated by big private sector interests, but they're all about spending public money and setting public policy, and they're not very inclusive, and more of that later, I think. So our mainstreaming community economic development project was very well timed for this new interest after the recession in our agenda, in the localisation agenda. In 2012, we were funded by Barrow Cadbury, who are a national charitable trust with a particular interest in the Birmingham area. Oh, there was a question about transition towns. I'll just answer that. I think it's probably best to look it up, really. Transition towns is quite a movement now that's got representation right across the world. But it's really about a transition to a low carbon and low material resource economy. But it tends to involve groups of people in a town getting together and perhaps starting food growing projects and other sort of small-scale initiatives, and sometimes they'll try and do a bit more and sort of get involved with the policymakers in an area and bring in small businesses. But it tends to be quite a sort of community-level type scheme, which doesn't necessarily make the bigger difference that I think might be needed. Ah, yes, thank you, Mike. That's the Wikipedia link. Source of all knowledge, Wikipedia. So,
is Totnes in Localise West Midlands area?
No, it's not in our area. They're right down on the south, but we talk to them quite a lot because they're one of the most advanced transition towns, and they've done some really brilliant work, including Reconomy, which is a very specifically localisation-focused project looking at what capacity there might be in the local economy to localise further. And they're looking at, social care, food, energy, those sorts of sectors.
Yep, an interesting model. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so the piece of research we did was funded by Barrow Cadbury. The purpose was to research what the benefits are of a more localised economy as opposed to a perhaps more globalised one, and how to integrate these localised or community economic development approaches into mainstream economic development as delivered by the public and private sectors. And then, of course, working on communicating and influencing and trialling approaches like these. In terms of the terminology, I think you'll notice that we're using the terms localisation and community economic development together. And we've been a bit creative in our definition making, I suppose. What we wanted to do was make sure that we weren't only community-led economic development involving, residents and community organisations, but also at the, I think I have just clicked, yes, further on, sorry. We were also looking at the private sector economy because that provides most of our livelihoods, and it's the thing that politicians and civil servants and unions and business organisations see as important. So we wanted to make the point that community development can be community-based in terms of community organisations with social objectives, or just by all actors in a place, the owners, the investors, the purchasers and the networkers, recognising their strengths in working together and what they'll gain from that. Hence the importance of the mainstreaming word in our name. And I see from CEDNet's materials that they cover this same breadth of activities, from the community initiative to the thing that's really trying to shift the paradigm. So I'm sure you'll be as familiar with the problem that we're seeking to address through this work and our hypothesis as to its causes. You'll be as familiar with that as I am. This David Corton quote captures it perfectly for me. Discussions of capitalism ignore the essential issue of concentration, an economic system in which private ownership is distributed such that almost every person has an ownership stake in his or her own home, and the business on which his or her livelihood depends is one thing. An economic system in which ownership is concentrated in the hands of a few thousand people is quite another. So the problem in terms of UK economic development, to me, is that it tends to focus far too much on the larger scale solutions and forget that there's a potential collective power at the smaller scale and what they call the foundational economy, the unglamorous, important services we depend on. And we put more effort into attracting and retaining than we do into catalysing and initiating based on what we've already got. We don't see the assets that are in places that can be used. And we seek short-term gains, but we forget about longer-term impacts. And our assumption is that this drains away with this giant sucking sound the money and the jobs from the area, and that leads to other social problems. So the literature review, which Mike referred to earlier, is one of the most important outputs of the work that we did in 2012, because it was a summary of the evidence around these sorts of impacts. And we were very surprised to find that there was plenty of rhetoric around this, but surprisingly little analysis of the impacts of different economic approaches. There were quite a lot of books like Colin Hines' Localisation, a Global Manifesto, and I can't remember who wrote The Case Against the Global Economy. Books like this which really sort of very strongly pronounced on how a localisation approach was better. But when you actually looked into it to see what evidence they'd collected, there was actually very little. And therefore what we found was that the literature review that we'd done was a much more significant part of the research findings, because it seemed to have been the first time that this material had been collated. We did find studies that covered this directly and touched on or that touched on particular elements of it, so perhaps retail, studies of different models of retail or social enterprise or manufacturing. And the literature did in the end reflect a correlation between economies with a higher proportion of locally owned businesses and social benefits such as economic inclusion, well-being, social and economic benefits in fact, and also that localised economies were more successful in purely economic terms. And it was complex and difficult to work out why this happened, but part of it is simply the local multiplier concept, which you'll probably be familiar with, about money circulating in a local area. But also, and of course, social capital gains multiply through that process as well. But one of our sources that we looked at compared inward investors and central government to absentee landlords, because they have a lack of understanding and commitment to a local area, and this shows in their decisions. So that their dominance in an area tends to create short-term gains, but then a reinforcing cycle of decline in the business environment. So CED initiatives, I think, are a really important way of starting to challenge that sort of paradigm, and we need more of them in the UK. And developing a strong local economy increases local decision-making power and has a slower and longer-term success. So this is the virtuous circle that we've then featured on our Localising Prosperity website now, in which a higher proportion of local businesses first contributes directly to local returns, but then also means that there's a higher proportion of locally committed people making decisions, And that creates a good environment for businesses to thrive, and that means more success, and the whole thing becomes circular in a very positive way. So, some snippets from our findings. There was a range of studies like this, the one that's quoted in Stacey Mitchell's book, a range of studies over the decades that have found better success and well-being linked to a higher proportion of locally owned businesses. In the UK, we subsidise foreign direct investment jobs much more heavily than locally grown business. So there's an 80% higher public cost per job and less local benefit. Cooperatives we think of as very small and insignificant in the UK. It's not something we've done enough with, but of course they've got massive potential, and there's a quote on there from Imola in Italy, I think, where they've had much more of an important impact. Small businesses, we found, are much better at moving people from unemployment into work, and there was a study by the Federation of Small Businesses that really highlighted that quite starkly. 92% of movements from unemployment were down to SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And then, of course, out-of-town food stores cause a net loss of jobs in their local area. I think that's a well-aired topic in the United States and in the UK and probably in Canada as well. Some of our sources, from memory, I scanned through the list and thought that these were the ones that stood out for me for different reasons, really. Some of them are very thorough, rigorous, and quite turgid to read, such as the Dynamics of Rural Areas study by Bryden and Hart. And others are just a damn good read, and I definitely recommend them, like the Schumann Small Mart Revolution, which some of you might be familiar with. So then the next thing we did was sort of move on to researching how, by sort of some action research, how economic development decision makers can integrate localised approaches into their conventional economic development. And I've got 3 slides that sort of quickly summarise this, because I expect it's not new to many of you. Obviously, nationally, we made a set of recommendations around policy and tax and subsidy change. But in terms of a local approach, we're talking about a strategic approach across different sectors, which again is a common theme in CED. It's about understanding the collective importance of the small scale. It's about treating the local economy as an ecosystem of independent supply and demand chains and creating a relationship-based economy. It's about maximising local power over local decisions instead of handing them to absentee landlords, and putting people with genuine local commitment into important positions. So much of that's about sort of seeing things differently and changing cultures. There's a set of more practical recommendations about understanding local assets and where money leaks from the local economy, identifying local needs and demands and creating business opportunities around those, identifying key linkage businesses like wholesale markets and abattoirs, and even some consultancies which sort of support a lot of other economic activity hangs on them, and it's very easy for policy to protect or destroy those linkage businesses. Negotiating, supporting and encouraging multinationals and remote-owned institutions to buy into the local economy, and developing locally relevant business support structures. We found that in our case studies, the nationally controlled business support structures were seen as completely irrelevant, and the local run ones were really valued for their responsiveness to local stakeholders. And again, that's something I've seen in a lot of CED good practice in looking through the Canadian resources. And then we emphasise business networking and cross-sectoral partnerships as well. And just the last few quick recommendations around planning, providing premises for small businesses and startups. It's almost too obvious to mention, really. Walkable communities and live-work patterns. Considering job losses as well as job gains from a new development and factoring those in. Maintaining diversity in land ownership. I've often heard land ownership fragmentation described as a problem amongst decision makers in Birmingham, which shocks me. And making development conditions conditional on using local procurement portals. And finally, alerting local businesses to potential development so that they can take they can be ready to take advantage of the opportunities that might arise. So all of that work, and particularly the evidence base of the literature review, really was groundbreaking for us, and it opened a lot of doors and has really helped to get us to places where we weren't getting to before. But there was still a bit of a problem, really. I think although the name of our project was Mainstreaming Community Economic Development, as soon as people saw the second word, they forgot the first word, the third word, and the fourth word. I don't know if that happens to you guys as well. Once they see the word community, it just gets put in that little box so that the big boys can get on with the real economic development where the real stuff is happening. They think it's nice, but they don't think it's really anything to do with them. So for our next project, we adopted the name Localising Prosperity, and that was our attempt, and everything within that site really is our attempt to overcome that language barrier and encourage those who normally take growth as the ultimate goal and never think about who benefits from it, to take it more seriously, and to think perhaps more about who benefits and how we can make sure that more people benefit from economic development. It's about maximising the benefits from everything that happens, not just about focusing on a couple of little initiatives in the corner. So the website, which has come up on your screens, that's just, I think, the front page of it. We've produced a set of resources on there, which includes tools and guidance and case studies and checklists. And again, I'm sure some of it will be really obvious to you, but hopefully what might not be is, or what might be a bit newer, is the way that we're sort of framing that, not for ourselves really, not for people that understand this agenda already, but for people who don't. And I think we have found that we have now found the right language to appeal to decision makers here and to appeal to people that weren't listening to us before. So I'll just trot through some good practice that's listed on our site, some of which you might know about already. These are two UK cities that you might be less familiar with. There's Preston, a northern town which was spurred into action by the impacts of the recession. And their main tactics are supporting community or worker buyouts of private businesses that are at risk, working to combine the purchasing power of its social organisations, and working on stronger networks of cooperatives, learning from really good stuff that happens in Spain and Italy. Then there's Enfield, which is a North London district with sort of similar socio-economic problems to Birmingham's. And what they've done is that they felt they didn't have many strings to their bow economic development-wise, but they thought that they identified the big businesses that would not be leaving the area, say gas companies and the water company, that have fixed markets amongst the local population, and they approached them to see what they'd be prepared to do. They said, you're gaining money from our local people, you're not giving much back. What are you going to do to create employment and other local economic returns in the local area? So in a sense, all they could do was ask, but I think it shamed some of those companies into doing something, and the water company and the gas company are now taking action to train local people to procure more locally and to create jobs. This next one is really interesting to me. It's not advancing for some reason. Let me just check. There we go. Birmingham wholesale markets. This is different because it's not a CED initiative. It just has excellent, totally accidental social impacts. Wholesale markets are getting quite scarce in the UK because our food chains are dominated by multinational supermarket chains and their distribution networks. So this market is an integrated fruit, veg, meat, fish and flour market right in the city centre. It's made up of 73 trading operations. It's got an aggregate turnover of 275 million. They reckon that 15,000 jobs are dependent on those markets. Plus, of course, it's an excellent source of fresh food and jobs for disadvantaged people right in the city centre. But, of course, it's prime city centre land, and the local authority is strapped for cash, and they want more prestige uses on that central site because that way they can bring them more money. And so they're forcing it to the outskirts. That's simply by selling off the site, by the way, to the highest bidder, I think. So the market's going to be forced to the outskirts. And we'd like to know what local benefits will the new uses on that site really bring. Will it have the same local returns when it's owned by an absentee landlord? will the social benefits of the markets be weakened if they're no longer really central right in the city centre? And how can we compare and consider the real impacts of these options? And which businesses' voices do we hear loudest in the decision making? The next example should be more familiar to you, I guess. We were really struck by this. Community development corporations are not something we're familiar with, and I've gathered since there are a few, and I think Stuart Perry had a role in the first one in Cape Breton. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Which was equally impressive, really, and I guess I should have picked that one rather than RISO. But I think RISO was the first one I heard about, so it made a big impression on me. We were really struck by how it compared to our current set of local economic partnerships that our government have introduced, because it has explicitly social objectives. It involves all sectors, including the trade union. That's so radical in UK terms, but it's social sector led. And it seems to use its local knowledge and its networking as an asset and build its business support on that. And it certainly seems to have had more economic impact than our exclusive, big business-focused, growth-obsessed, so-called local enterprise partnerships. So we're now thinking that we'd like to try and encourage this model in the UK and try to get something similar. And I'm sure you could tell me so much more about how that could work really well. So that's one thing that we're hoping to move on to doing next. A few other things. We're hoping to work with a new hospital that's proposed in the area to support them in seeing their role in the local economy as being as important a tool for the area's health and well-being as their medical departments. We're hoping to introduce a Birmingham pound. I don't know, again, I'm not at all sure what the Canadian experience of alternative currencies is, but this is basically a locally branded sterling pound that can only be spent with locally owned organisations. And Bristol is the city that's really doing well with this. Birmingham is, as I said, very culturally diverse, and we're all incredibly keen that this becomes a currency that everyone in the city feels is theirs to use, and it could be a real strength. The Bank of England has said, by the way, that they're not worried about these so long as they stay small. So our ambition at the moment is to worry the Bank of England. Then we're taking part in the government's Community Economic Development Initiative. Now, the CED term had not been heard from the mouth of a civil servant until this programme emerged in 2013, and it was very exciting to hear them talking about it. It's basically a plan to help 50 communities to make CED plans, which obviously being a government department, they expect them to do to a rigid timescale in an exactly similar way, within a year. But that's government for you. We're going to be an advisor to one community, and we're really looking forward to that. And then we want to use that experience to identify where community economic efforts and those of public policy diverge, and to try and address that gap. And that's one of the exciting things we're hoping to do next. And then finally, we'd like to get more of a collective voice for organisations across the UK who see this better, more decentralised, more locally owned economics as crucial, to work together and have a louder collective voice. Perhaps something like a cross between CCEDNet and is it the New Economy Coalition in the States, something along those lines. So finally, to finish, I think I'm really interested in where community economics and the private sector meet, and in the paradigm shift that we might be able to achieve from that. Most of our livelihoods are in the private sector, and if we don't work with that as activists, I don't think we can succeed. We do have some private sector friends who are genuinely progressive and who understand, I think, that if they cooperate with their local area, everybody will benefit, including their business. But that's pretty rare in the UK. And sometimes I think that more social benefit comes from the most regressive bunch of small businesses in comparison with one multinational's CSR agenda. And I think exploring that decentralised capitalism is crucial for that reason. And localisation to me is a gently radical agenda that starts people off on a greater culture change around what interests the economy should serve. And potentially it's politically pro-business, and that helps, but it also addresses public concerns over the concentrations of wealth and power, and that helps as well. So I think if we can sort of focus on that sweet spot of where the two meet, we could really get somewhere in the UK. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Karen. That's what an interesting presentation, and lots of leads and questions raised. So I think there's been a couple questions posted, but we wanted to give a first opportunity to hear reflections and reaction from Stuart Perry. Stuart is an honorary lifetime member of CEDNet, one of the pioneers of CED in the U.S. and Canada, as both a policy advisor and a designer and manager of CED institutions. As head of the U.S. Center for Community Economic Development, he helped create the first finance institution for CED, the Massachusetts Community Development Finance Authority. And as you mentioned, Karen, he helped start Canada's first community development corporation, New Dawn Enterprises, in Sydney, Nova Scotia, and headed the Community Economic Development Center in Cape Breton there as well. As a consultant, researcher, and author, Stuart currently specializes in community and development finance as an associate with the Canadian Centre for Community Renewal. So, Stuart, what jumped out for you hearing and reading the work by Karen and Localise West Midlands?
Well, first of all, I just want to congratulate her organization on this very, very effective examination of the actual results of localized community economic development. The title of the thing is Mainstreaming Economic Development for Inclusiveness, Diversity, and Equality. But it's really a survey of all the important information on what has been the results of this kind of work. So I want to recommend that. I was particularly interested in the emphasis on that she made on the local businesses, and it recalled to me a recent post from Eugene, Oregon, where the local CDC there was trying to do just exactly what I have the lost the name of our presenter here. Karen, of course. Karen emphasized what small business can do within the local community, and much more effective kinds of influences upon the local economy, especially in employment, for example. This Eugene, Oregon group, there Alana Probst went around to, who was the executive director of the CDC, went around to all the small businesses to find out what they were buying from outside the community. And she got a list of all these things, and then she showed all these local businesses that there were local suppliers who could give them, sell them what they were buying from the outside. And these local businesses didn't know about the local suppliers. They just were unaware of them. And they discovered that sometimes the local suppliers could give them the same kind of thing at less cost. And so it was a really amazing use of local resources to reinforce the circulation of local capital. I think the thing that I would also pick up from Karen's comments was the fact of the interrelations of it all in the local area. We're talking about how things fit together, and it's not just a economic ecosystem there. It's an ecosystem of all the events and activities that are going on locally, so that they reinforce poverty or they can reinforce change. And so we have to look at the local community in its totality and not just the businesses. One of the things that occurred to me, she mentioned the fact that you would want to look at businesses that are under threat and to see if there can't be a change in ownership to, for example, the employees of the business. And this is a general kind of issue all over the world, because we're talking about a post-war generation of people who have built their own small businesses and operated them successfully, but they're at the point of retirement. And so we're going to have to look for ways in which there can be a translation of this business so that it can be maintained in the local community. And certainly worker ownership is one of the main tools to use to deal with that worldwide event. I wanted to comment on something that Karen said about her own background. She says, I don't have any formal training in this. And I'd like to point out, I don't have any formal training in the community economic development either. And most of us don't, because it's been the kind of field that didn't have that sort of training available, and we've had to learn it. So I want to point out to other people, look, they don't necessarily need formal training in this field. You need to have the sophistication of a good observer and the commitment of a local community member. We have some graduate programs in community economic development, both in the States and in Canada, but they're not necessarily the best way to find out how to do things, which can be discovered from your colleagues in the local setting. That's about all I'd like to comment on right now, but maybe I'll make other comments later on or answer questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stuart. Is there anything in that you wanted to react to quickly, Karen, before we get into the comments from the chat box?
Well, just to thank you for the congratulations, Stuart. That was really nice to hear. Also, just briefly, I was struck by what you said about the post-war generation and the small businesses run by that generation, and the fact that we're about to see a change because of their reaching retirement age. That's not something I've thought about, but I think it's equally applicable in the UK, and it's something I might explore with colleagues. And secondly, on the idea of having formal training, yes, I think what happens is that if you start doing CED, then you get people with economic development training telling you that you don't know what you're talking about unless you know what they know.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which I think we all know is totally wrong. And there's a rather lovely green economist who's well known here in the UK called Molly Scott Cato, who I've very often heard telling audiences very firmly that they do not need to know about economic development, and probably the more formally trained expertise they have in it, the more damage they're going to do.
Right.
So I think that's an important one.
The less training, the better, yeah.
Well, I like to say that community economic development is not a profession, it's not an occupation, it's a mission. And that's, we have to look at it in terms of the fact of our commitment to social change, and not as a case of simply applying technical information.
Very good reminder. Thank you, Stuart and Karen. I want to get to some of the questions here that have been posted. Sandra raises a good, I think, an interesting element of it. She's completing her social MBA with her thesis on social enterprise as a community economic development tool. And she said in doing her research for her thesis, she was surprised at the dearth of academic research in this area. I know, Karen, we often look to the UK as being the leads on social finance and social enterprise. You have a pretty robust social enterprise network. Did any of your research or literature review thinking look at how social enterprise, what role it could play, some of its advantages or disadvantages in your strategies?
Yes, there was some information around that, and there were some rather disparaging studies about how X% of social enterprises were dependent on subsidies and therefore weren't real, etc., as you can imagine. So there was some of that to sift through and get to the bottom of. And some of it, has a basis in fact in terms of the way that they're run and the people get involved. But more positively, there was quite a lot of emphasis around the, I suppose, the difficulty which you'll be very familiar with in terms of evaluating anything with that social element to it is that it is so much more complex than the sort of the quick nuts and bolts of say an inward investment strategy. I think we have a much harder job to do in terms of evaluating something that has social outcomes, and I'm sure we're all familiar with that. There was one other thing I was going to say, but it's gone out of my head now. So move on.
Okay. No, I think your point that it is extremely difficult, right? There's complex evaluation processes and tools to evaluate the impact or return on investment and sustainability. I was just going to be pulling up here. I think what Sandra, if I understand right, is getting at is an extremely delicate question, because evaluating for example, the social return on investment or the impact of social enterprises as programs on their own is one difficult measurement. And I just put a link in the chat box there for a compilation of program evaluations and a lot of SROI measures, often of social enterprises or programs. I think there's a couple of excellent examples from Momentum there on that page. So that's just one angle of it. But when you think about the mix of different strategies and the, when a social enterprise might be an appropriate tool versus other options, that becomes, I think, the art of community development, right? Looking at the assets and the opportunities and then the range of strategies available. And it's I think, quite a science or art, probably.
Yes. The Centre for Local Economic Strategies in Manchester in the UK is another organisation that's very good at this, but whether they are ahead or behind CEDNet, I have no idea, but it might be another good source just to check and see if there's anything else there.
Yes, I totally agree. I posted a link to Centre for Local Economic Strategies a bit higher up in the chat box, and as well as the New Economics Foundation. And so if we have time, I'd be interested to come back on to your idea of some sort of leadership network or something that blends some of those approaches. But let's keep going with the questions. We have one more here related to a project around hospitals being built on Vancouver Island. And Sandra, once again, here has been spending some time trying to get local food or local suppliers into the new hospitals. And the question that I had for her is if she was familiar with the anchor institution model that's being promoted, I think principally, or at least the lead thinkers on this are from the Democracy Collaborative in the United States at the University of Baltimore, Maryland. Have you, I imagine you're aware of this anchor institution strategy, Karen. Have you thought about it, or has it been applicable in Localise West Midlands as a CED approach?
Yes. It's not something we've engaged with very actively yet, but I think the work around the hospital is obviously very much taking that anchor institution approach, and we're just starting to explore that now. There's another organisation in the UK that has started well, they've set up a motorway service station as an anchor institution, as a social enterprise, sourcing locally, creating local jobs, training people who are from disadvantaged backgrounds and so on. And I think that's a really interesting idea, because I don't know how this applies in Canada, but we are increasingly, in the UK, we're increasingly seeing a reduction in the public money that's available and in institutions that are still publicly run, which means that I think we have to start looking at what opportunities there are just to meet the other services that we all have, which have been traditionally provided by the private sector. And I think a motorway service station is a really good example of that.
You're talking about government programs and policies. We have a question here from Toronto, Ontario, where a recent announcement by the provincial government there has just declared that all new infrastructure projects will include community benefit agreements to support local hiring, particularly of people with barriers to employment. Of course, the results, whether this actually gets implemented and how well it works remains to be seen. But Paul's question was, are there any government policies that have supported your local economic or community economic development strategies there? You mentioned that the local enterprise partnerships, I think, have tended to be even more negative than positive.
Yes, there's three things that are occurring to me here, one of which is very, very small, but a nice example. I'm just making notes so I don't forget the three of them as I go along.
Sure.
The first thing is the Social Value Act, which sounds a little bit like what you have in Toronto. It's UK-wide, and I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's basically that all public spending should include an element of social value as an outcome from it. So all procurement officers in all public institutions across the UK are now having to think about when they procure and when they commission. They can no longer just go for the cheapest, which is often provided by one of these big multinationals that doesn't give a lot back. But they actually have to think about what social value, what local jobs, what training, etc. is being created. That's brilliant, but what we're finding now, because of the way it's being implemented and because our government organisations are not run that well, and they tend to not be efficient enough to know where to maximise local value, is that the big corporations, I don't know if you know Sercos and the big organisations that deliver a lot of public services, they've learned how to deal with this. They've learned how to sell themselves as having social value, and the organisations that really are delivering social value simply by their existence and their structure are less good at explaining it. So it's a great act, but it's going to take a bit of time before we see that really having benefit for local business, and that's one of the things we want to work on next, is making sure that we can help smaller organisations to demonstrate what their real social value is, whether they're private sector or non-profit social enterprise. Local enterprise partnerships, yes, similarly, they sound like a good idea. A local enterprise partnership sounds a bit like a community development corporation, but they're not. And in Birmingham, for example, ours is headed up by one of the big retail chains from the UK. And it really doesn't, there's a lot of complaints from small business, let alone from the community sector, that they just don't understand them, they don't listen to them, and we have very, very little input into what they decide. And this is public money they're spending. It's very anti-democratic. And finally, just as a little example, we have for quite a while, for a couple of decades, we've had a good policy on brewing, and we have a very, very healthy culture of real ale brewers in the UK, and that's because there's basically a tax break for microbreweries. So once a brewery gets to a certain size, it has to stop growing or decide that it's going to really grow and pay the extra tax. And that tends to mean that we have this wonderful, diverse culture of lots and lots of real ale brewers, which, as a real ale fan, that's fantastic for me. but it's a great model for what we could do with some other parts of the economy. Not all, obviously. Some things need much greater specialisation and scale, but perhaps some parts of the food sector and so on that could have a similar tax break and have similar benefits.
Very interesting. Okay, I want to take one more question or sort of opening of a discussion here from the chat box, and then ask you one last before we wrap, if we can just maybe keep people on for a couple more minutes. When we were talking about ownership transfer, Sandra suggested the idea of worker ownership in partnership with a community charity, perhaps, or another partner. And I asked for clarification around that, and she said that it could be an arrangement, whether in Quebec we have worker shareholder cooperatives where there can be worker owners that own a portion of the shares in a partnership in a company. But she also mentioned that it could be a good function for a hybrid corporation. Of course, the UK is another leader there with community interest companies, and those models are being replicated around the world now. In BC has passed to it, Nova Scotia an announced one, but the regulations haven't come out, and Ontario is currently doing consultations on the benefits of those kind of hybrid social benefit companies. What have you any assessment of how important or valuable those have been in CED structures in the UK, Karen?
No, I don't think I do. I think we have focused more on, as I've said before, really, on the private sector economy and how that brings social benefit, whether it intends to or not. So perhaps that's why, really, we haven't looked so much at the social enterprise type structures. But I do know, and I love the idea of a hybrid corporation, and I'm going to look into that a bit more, so thank you. But I do know that quite a lot of people involved in the cooperative movement have a problem with the CIC model, and I don't know what it is. So somebody mentioned this to me the other day, and I thought I must look that up and find out what the tension is. They say it doesn't work, and that it's the wrong structure and will achieve the wrong outcomes. More than that, as yet, I do not know, but it might be an interesting thing for other people to look at.
Yeah, I think there's lots of debates, the pros and cons of the proliferation of sort of corporate structures and models, and sometimes people are familiar with certain approaches and, feel that they can be widely applicable. And I'm reminded of a comment Stuart made not too long ago, that we should try to avoid getting focused on the tools, right, whether it's a social enterprise or something else, and remain focused on the outcomes, the objectives, the benefits, and the change that we want for our communities. And so the approach you've taken on looking at the evidence, what really works and what doesn't, regardless of the form or structure or strategy, is a solid way to go. So the last question I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the new UK CED program is the first time that government officials had used the words community economic development in a very long time. Do you have any sense of what prompted that? What would perhaps your report have led to a resurgence of interest in community economic development, or were there other factors at play? Do you any tips you can give us here in Canada?
Yeah, I've been wondering about this myself, to be honest. I would really, really like to get to the bottom of this, because some of the language used in the CED materials from that department when they first came out, they just sounded like our work. I could have written them. They used the same vocabulary, and I don't know if that was just coincidence, and perhaps we just happened to, how this does happen, the same initiatives come up at the same time because they're on the crest of some sort of wave, and I think there's an element of that about it. Transition towns have been talking, there's a group of organisations that have got together recently in this collective voice sort of idea, and that includes Reconomy, which is the Transition Towns initiative that I mentioned earlier, New Economics Foundation, Claire's, ourselves, etc. And we have been talking. So perhaps it was just that somebody had a quiet word with somebody who had a quiet word with somebody else, and the initiative came from that. I don't know. Yeah, super. But they really did read. They just used exactly the same terminology that we've been using.
Well, congratulations on that. That's fabulous news. All right, so we're just a bit over time. I should wrap up because everyone no doubt has other things to get onto, but here's a few more links for some more information, some of the references. There were a lot that were also posted in the chat box today. And if you'd like to stay in touch around CED-related issues, check out the CEDNet website or sign up for our free email newsletters. Also, everyone registered for the session should have just received an email with a link to a 1-minute evaluation survey. If you don't mind just taking a minute, it really is short, and filling it out, your feedback is very important for us in improving these sessions and making sure we're offering topics and a format that's most relevant for our members and people interested in community economic development. So once again, many thanks to Karen and Stuart for sharing their unique perspective and experiences. Thank you to all the participants for your questions and participation. The webinar recording will be posted on our website in the coming days, and we'll send you a link, everyone, a link as soon as it's available. And once again, just in signing off here, I'll unsync the presentation, and we'll leave the webinar room open for a while so people can scroll back through the slides if you want to look at a few things more. So thank you very much, Karen and Stuart.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.